trick or treat.
Do not reach in that bucket. These true Halloween stories will show you why. Rain trickled down the streets of Deer Park, Texas. The year was 1974, and all across the neighborhood, kids were out trick-or-treating dressed as ghosts and goblins. The O'Brien's family were doing the same. The father, an optician named Ronald, was watching over 8-year-old Timothy and 5-year-old Elizabeth, along with Ronald's friend and his young son. Little did they know that for one of them, it'd be their last Halloween. Walking down the road, the group knocked on the door of a house with its lights off. No answer. Shrugging, everyone ran on to try their luck further ahead. Everyone, that is, except for Ronald. But everybody was too excited to think anything of it. Then, a little while later, the father suddenly reappeared, chasing after them with something in his palm. He told the group that there had been someone in the blacked-out house all along, and they'd given him a handful of pixie sticks, tubes of sweet and sour powder. He handed one to each of the children and another to a passing 10-year-old he knew from church. Then, back at home, Ronald let Timothy eat one before bed. The sugar was all stuck in the straw, so his dad helped him dislodge it, and he slurped it down. But it tasted strange, almost bitter. Thinking nothing of it, Ronald handed the boy a glass of Kool-Aid to wash the taste away and sent him to bed. Timothy never woke up. At the morgue, an examiner noticed a distinctive almond scent coming from the boy's mouth. Cyanide. Quickly realizing what had happened, the police tracked down the remaining pixie sticks. By sheer luck, none of the other children had eaten them. All of them had been laced with the deadly poison. When investigators quizzed Ronald about the mysterious house he'd got them from, he claimed he couldn't recall anything about it. Growing frustrated, they took a tougher stance, and sure enough, he miraculously remembered. The police found and arrested the homeowner, except he had an alibi. He'd been out working that night, and although his wife and daughter were at home, they'd turned the lights off after running out of candy and definitely hadn't answered the door to Ronald. Then the police discovered something even more worrying. At the start of the year, Ronald had taken out massive life insurance policies on both of his children and was over $100,000 in debt. What's more, phone records revealed that the morning after his son's death, Ronald had called his insurer at 9 a.m. sharp. That was enough to get a search warrant for his home. In one drawer, they found a pair of scissors with plastic residue attached to it. Residue that matched a Pixie Sticks packet. As the investigation proceeded, the evidence only became more damning. A community college professor that Ronald had taken classes with revealed that he'd asked if there was any poison more lethal than cyanide. And a chemical salesman said a man dressed in optician's clothing came in to buy cyanide but left disappointed when the maximum he could get was 5 pounds. At the time, police couldn't prove that Ronald had bought the Pixie Sticks or the cyanide. Regardless, they had enough evidence to charge him. The story threw the media into a frenzy, and they sinisterly dubbed Ronald O'Brien the Candyman. During the trial, the disgraced father maintained his innocence, but eventually he was found guilty and sentenced to lethal injection. Even though he's long gone, the Candyman's unsettling legacy hasn't been forgotten. 2 decades later, on Halloween night in Minneapolis, in 2000, 4 teenagers were going through their trick-or-treating hall when something horrific happened. Grabbing a chocolate bar, one of them bit into it and screamed. A quick, sharp sting splintered through his gums, and after ripping the candy from his mouth, he saw there was a metal needle poking out of it. Shocked, the teens handed their candy to the police, who immediately started looking for whoever the twisted culprit was. Before long, they found him. The boogeyman was a 49-year-old James J. Smith, and as well as handing out spiked candy to those unfortunate teenagers, he'd also given it to 3 other children. Unlike Ronald O'Brien, though, Smith was far from a calculating monster. He was deemed unfit to stand trial, and the last I could find was committed to a mental health facility. If you ever go to Fairfax County, Virginia, you might hear locals whispering of a strange and unsettling legend they call The Bunny Man. Supposedly years ago, a bloodthirsty lunatic escaped from an insane asylum and now dons a filthy white rabbit costume and wields an axe as he haunts the bridge under Colchester Road. But while that may just be a myth, it's based in scary reality. Back in October 1970, the Washington Post reported that on Halloween night, a young couple were sitting in a car on Guinea Road when all of a sudden, a man dressed in a white suit with long bunny ears sprang from the nearby bushes shouting, "You're on private property." The costumed man then hurled a hatchet at the car, shattering the front passenger window. The couple were terrified, but then as swiftly as it had appeared, the figure turned on its heels and scurried off into the night. For 2 calm weeks, there were no more sightings. Then, a security guard for a construction company was on duty when he noticed the rabbit standing on the front porch of an unoccupied house. Bemused, the guard approached him, but whoever it was inside the suit remained eerily silent. Then, the rabbit pulled an axe from behind him and repeatedly smashed it into the roof support. The guard jumped back in surprise as the onslaught continued. Then the rabbit spoke. "All you people trespass around here. If you don't get out of here, I'm gonna bust you in the head." At this, the guard ran over to his car to grab his handgun, but by the time he got there, the figure had run off into the woods. Following this, there were dozens more sightings reported by scared residents, but despite plenty of hearsay and wild goose chases, the true identity of the mysterious Bunny Man was never discovered. So how did he end up associated with what's now known as Bunny Man Bridge? Well, this creepy overpass in Fairfax isn't far from the real-life Bunny Man sightings, and you can see why it's got a reputation for being haunted. One legend tells of a group of friends finding half-eaten rabbits hanging around the trees in the area, and if you cross through the dark tunnel at midnight on Halloween, the axe-bearing monster is said to appear, ready to give you the same fate. Whatever you believe, we may never truly know who the Bunny Man was or his motives. Sadly, there are much worse monsters than men in suits, as Marvin and Ethel Brandland, an elderly couple from Fort Dodge, Iowa, discovered on Halloween night in 1982. They spent their evening answering the door to costumed children and happily handing out candy. But long after the night had grown late and the children had gone home, there was a sudden, much louder knock. Despite the lateness of the hour, they answered and froze in shock. Standing in the doorway was not a child, but a man. His face covered by a pillowcase with 2 eye holes torn into the fabric. In a youngish voice, he said, "Trick or treat. Give me your money or I'll shoot." The couple looked at each other nervously. Surely this was a joke. But then the pillow-faced man pulled out a gun from his waistband. He wasn't joking. Pillowface ordered them to take him down to their basement, where the Brandlands kept their safe. Yet something wasn't right. The only people who knew their safe was in the basement were close family members. Marvin shook his head, refusing to listen to the man's demands, and stepped forward to reach for the gun. Pillowface shot, and it met its target. The old man fell to the floor, clutching his throat. Then, panicked, the mystery gunman whipped off the pillowcase and fled. Heartbreakingly, Marvin passed away. When the police came to investigate, Ethel insisted she knew Pillowface, saying he was an acquaintance of the family. But his name has never been released to the public, and authorities didn't have enough evidence to tie him to the crime. The pillowcase was even submitted to DNA testing in 2010, but to no avail. So to this day, Marvin's senseless passing remains unpunished, and Pillowface's identity is lost forever. This next blood-curdling tale is from Redditor mhop99. The dark waters of Lake Vermilion, Minnesota, were deathly still as Hop and 3 of his friends drove up to the cabin they'd be vacationing in for the next week. Isolated is an understatement. The cabin itself is on a large forested island in the middle of the lake, and to get to it, the 4 friends had to park up near the water before getting a boat over. They were very much alone, but that didn't bother them. They did this every year. This time, however, it would be different. That night, after reaching the cabin, Hop lay in bed, and as usual, he couldn't help but stare through the curtainless windows at the vast lake outside. A thought crept into his mind that something was out there, staring back at him, but he put it down to his overactive imagination. On the third night, the group braved the fall chill and sat in the front yard around a campfire, chugging beers and chatting. But then they heard a loud splash, as if something had leapt into the water. Shocked, the chatter stopped, and they all stared out at the dark lake. It must have been a fish, right? Hop couldn't see anything, but Ryan looked like he'd seen a ghost. "What the hell is that?" he whimpered, pointing over toward the lake. And then Hop spotted it. Something pale out in the middle of the water like an orb. But the longer Hop stared, the more it started to look like something more. Was that a face with streaks of long black hair falling over it? No, it couldn't have been. The group reassured themselves it was probably just a bird, but they couldn't shake an unsettling feeling of being watched. So they went back to the cabin and took their minds off it with more beers. The night went on, and soon they'd forgotten all about the strange sighting. But after all that drinking, Hop needed to relieve himself. He stumbled outside and did his business in the great outdoors, but as he looked over the moonlit water, his heart leapt into his throat. The thing was still out there. Only now, it had crept some 30 yards or so closer. From here, Hop could see it clearer. White skin glowing in the moonlight and matted black hair clung over sunken eyes that seemed to be staring directly at him. There was no doubt about it now. It was a human head. Terror and revulsion shot through Hop's body, and shaking, he called to the others. They rushed out and gasped. Deathly still, it floated there, staring, not a single ripple to suggest any movement. The group hurried back inside the cabin, and after a few more hours of nervous socializing, they decided to try and sleep. Perhaps they were just drunk and their eyes had deceived them. Hop lay in bed with his eyes shut tight, not daring to look out the window. But then he heard footsteps. It was somebody walking around the front of the house. Only Hop knew everyone was inside sleeping, so who could it be? The footsteps grew louder. Whoever it was, they were walking up the steps to the cabin. Then, just as they were nearing the front door, they stopped and ran back off into the distance. Hop jolted upright and turned to his roommate. He'd heard it too. They couldn't take it anymore. They needed to get out of there immediately. They burst into Ryan's room to wake him, but he was already awake and said 3 words that chilled Hop to the bone. "I saw it." Ryan shakily explained that as he'd laid in bed, he'd looked toward the window and seen someone peering in at him. He'd only managed to make out a dark eye set with white skin, with long black hair falling down around it, before it had quickly shifted out of view. That was the last straw. The group haphazardly packed their bags and ran out of the cabin, dashing straight toward the boat. As they did, Hop noticed bare footprints on the stairs. They jumped in, made the panicked journey across the water, then scrambled into a car and drove about 10 miles before Ryan broke down in tears, asking desperately, "What was it? What did I see?" But no one had an answer for him. To this day, Hop and his friends have no explanation for what they saw that night. One thing is for sure, though. They're never going back to the cabin on Lake Vermilion. Another tale of the unexplained comes from a now deleted Reddit account where the OP told a sinister story from their father's teenage years. Back in the 80s, their father, let's call him Sweeney, and his 4 friends decided to explore a lesser-known trail that followed a creek through the woods. As they pushed deeper into the forest, they came across a clearing with an old cottage in the center. Its white paint was peeling, and the windows were shattered. The whole place felt foreboding and looked like it could collapse at any moment, which of course meant the boys had to check it out. The door was unlocked, and inside, it was clear the cottage had been abandoned for years, with every surface covered in a thick layer of dust. Still, they crept further inside, and things only got weirder. Strange runes and symbols they didn't recognize were scrawled across the walls in crimson red. Other walls had barely intelligible English scratched into them. Sweeney could make out something to do with worship, sacrifice, the human soul, and an ancient god. Well, this is the point I'd be fleeing the scene. But for some reason, the group headed upstairs, where they found themselves in a large room. Like the others, it was covered in weird symbols, and at the far end was a circular window. Only the ceiling of this room had chains and manacles hanging from it, and the floor was dotted with puddles of dark, dried red. Then, in the far corner, Sweeney could have sworn he saw something shuffling in the darkness. Terrified, the group ran downstairs and burst out of the cottage back into the fresh air. Running on adrenaline, they followed their compass in the direction of home. Yet for some reason, it didn't work. After minutes of panicked running, they found themselves right back where they'd been, in front of the eerie cottage again. They tried over and over, but ended up there every single time. After who knows how long, one of the boys went pale. Sweat poured from his forehead and his body trembled before he collapsed to the ground. From here, he looked up at the circular window on the top floor of the cottage. The others followed his gaze and saw her. There, behind the glass, was a hunched old woman staring down at them. She lingered a moment watching, then shuffled away. After seeing that, the kid that fell miraculously found his strength, and the group bolted through the woods, forgetting all about the compass. This time, finally, they made it out to the safety of Sweeney's house. Even so, none of them could shake the horrible feeling that something had been following them the entire way. Regardless, days passed and the terror subsided. Then one morning, Sweeney was getting a glass of water from the kitchen tap when something outside the window caught his eye. He looked out toward the woodshed and froze. She was there again, hunched, watching. The same figure he'd seen in that messed-up cottage. Terrified, he forced himself to investigate, but when he got there, he found nothing. 5 years later, unable to forget their horrific experience, the group decided to head back and search for the cottage in hopes of proving they'd just been scared and seeing things. But where the house once stood was now just a pile of rubble. It had collapsed in on itself, taking its dark secrets with it. The woods are home to all manner of bizarre and nightmarish occurrences. Redditor Wilhelm Baudelaire was a British student visiting home when she decided to take a long walk through the woods around her town, something she did often as a child, so was comfortable with. Will walked for miles, leaving the path and eventually reaching the heart of the woods without seeing a soul. It was then that Will heard it, the sound of a bell, coming some distance from the north. Strange. Was it a hunting dog or something? No, it was too well timed, and from how loud it sounded, far too heavy for a dog to wear. But Will had never encountered anyone this deep in the woods before. She tried to shake the sudden uneasiness she felt and begrudgingly walked in the direction of the noise. It was the way back, after all. After 5 minutes, the ringing stopped, but then she saw something splayed out on the path ahead of her. It was a badger, or at least what was left of it. Let's just say the head was elsewhere and maggots were having a field day. Whatever was responsible must have done it recently, as there was barely a smell. Disgusted, Will picked up the pace and got home safely. A week later, it was raining, but Will wanted to journey back into the forest one more time before she went back to university. Little did she know, it would be the last time ever. She left around 6 p.m., following the same path as before. Except this time she was hurrying, as it was a bit late. Then she bumped into something odd hanging from a tree branch. It was a putrid, furry bag dripping with green juice and mucus. With horror, Will realized it was the same badger she'd come across before, only someone had strung its head to his front paws. She recoiled, a glob of putrid slime stuck in her hair, and began to gag. It stank. A cold shiver flowed through her. Whoever had strung the animal up like this must have known she'd come this way before. Why else would they have put it just there when they had the whole forest? Was it a warning? Looking around, Will couldn't see anyone, but then she heard ring, ring, ring coming from somewhere in the distance. Now, Will really panicked. Why had she come back? She grabbed her cell phone, called her dad, and told him to meet her at the edge of the forest. Dad told her he was on his way, which should have made her feel better, but the ringing was getting louder, which meant only one thing. It was getting closer. Will started running through the rain as fast as she could, rain pounding down now all around her. Every other sound was muffled, except for that piercing ringing. Desperately, Will bolted forward terrified, then made a terrible decision. She glanced back, and there it was, at the end of the clearing. A tall, male figure creeping forward and staring straight at Will, and in its hand was a bell. Will started screaming, turned back around, and ran as fast as her soaking legs would carry her. She screamed for her dad. She screamed that she was on the phone to the police. She screamed anything that might make her assailant think twice, the whole time hearing that terrible ringing. After what felt like a millennia, relief washed over her as she saw her dad pull up in his car. Without hesitating, Will wrenched the door open and leapt in. Her dad hit the gas and Will didn't look back. She didn't know if the figure was still following them. She never found out who he was or what he wanted. But she'll never forget the sound of that ringing in her head. Ring, ring, ring. Don't talk to strangers, especially not ones that smile at you. It was around 10 or 11 on Halloween night, and Redditor Ushud and her best friend Ashley were sat on the curb, the only kids left on the silent street. Ushud's family had gone to visit a different neighborhood, but they'd promised to keep their door open for her when she'd finished hanging out with a friend. The two girls were chatting away when suddenly they noticed a man shuffling along the road at the end of their court. He moved strangely, jolting his body erratically like a mix between a dance and a stumble. Then, mid-stagger, he suddenly stopped dead and turned his head down the road directly at the girls. He stayed like this for a few tense moments before hobbling away again out of view. The girls had never seen the man before, but he left a squirmy feeling in the pit of their guts, and he wasn't gone for long. They spotted him again, scuttling past in the distance with limbs twitching like a beetle stuck on its back. Then again, he stopped, this time beneath a street lamp. He was closer than before, and his big white eyes never left them. Thoroughly creeped out, the girls decided to go home. Ashley went to her house across the street, and Ushud kept walking alone, but she'd left the man far behind. When her home came into view, she breathed a sigh of relief and turned the front door handle, but it was locked. Her family had locked her out. She had no key, and this was before cell phones, so she had no way of contacting them either. Her heart beating faster, she wondered if she could break into the house when, behind her, she heard a strange rhythm of footsteps approaching. She turned, and there he was, with a smile so wide it seemed to curl past his eyes. The sight of him knocked the air out of her body like a blow to the stomach. She bolted, focusing entirely on getting to Ashley's house and not stopping until she got there. Thankfully, it wasn't far. She banged on the door and slammed the doorbell repeatedly. Ushud turned to see if he was following her. He was, but now he was running. She cried out through the door with all her might. Then finally it swung open. Ashley grabbed her by the arm, yanked her inside, and locked the door behind her, and not a moment too soon. Not a second later, they saw the man staring at them through the door's glass panel, his breath fogging it menacingly. They remained frozen like that for a stomach-churning moment before he finally ambled away. Ushud fell to the ground, sobbing uncontrollably, while Ashley consoled her. When her parents arrived, they apologized profusely for locking the door and immediately called the police, but they never found a trace of the smiling stranger. Another story of stranger danger comes from the Herefordshire town of Lemner. Redditor Mr. Evil Guy, who, despite his name, seems like a nice dad, was strolling through town one Halloween evening trick-or-treating with his 7-year-old son and 9-year-old daughter. The streets were alive with families dressed in all sorts of ghoulish costumes. And just for a moment, he took his eyes off the kids. When they came back, they were accompanied by a third child. She was silent and wore a homemade cardboard mask. His daughter asked whether she could trick-or-treat with them, and he consented, assuming she was a friend from school. But before long, Dad noticed a large man trailing behind them. He wore a cat mask, clearly made for a child, and there was something about the strange sight that sent a chill down the dad's back. To ease himself, he tried making small talk. "Nice weather, eh?" The man looked at him, silent. "Is that your daughter?" the dad asked. The big man nodded but said nothing more, so the dad gave up trying to chat, and they carried on for about another 15 minutes. Suddenly, Dad felt his kids tugging on his sleeve and looking down, saw they were trembling in fear. In low voices, they asked if they could go home. Confused and worried, the dad agreed and waved to the girl and her father. Neither of them responded. As they walked down the road, the dad glanced a few times down the street. They were still standing right where they left them, masks on, staring. "So, who was that girl?" he asked. His daughter looked up at him confused. She wasn't her friend. She'd never even met her before. The girl had told them she was the dad's friend and that she was just too shy to ask if she could join. The dad laughed. Why would he be friends with a child, only for his daughter to say, "She's not a child"? The dad felt a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach and turned around again. They'd made some distance from them, but he could just about see the girl had taken off her mask, only she wasn't a girl. She was a short, very old-looking woman. A chill ran through the dad's bones as his children told him that the man and the woman had been swiping candy from their bags. What kind of sicko steals candy from kids? Whoever they were, the dad hoped he and his children never met them again. Now here's an incredibly eerie account sent in from May in the Philippines. When she was 16, May and her parents were staying the night in a hotel on November 1st, All Saints' Day, a celebration akin to Halloween. Night fell, and May settled in for a peaceful sleep, or so she thought. Sometime during the night, she woke up drowsy and confused. She'd been roused by a noise, like something heavy dragging along the carpet outside in the corridor. On and on it went, getting closer and closer to her door. Then it stopped. Summoning the strength to get out of bed, she looked through the peephole. In front of her door was a chair. May was bemused. Why had someone left that there? Shrugging it off, she went back to bed. But just as she was drifting off again, she heard more noise. Curious and slightly annoyed, she got back out of bed and looked through the peephole again, and had the fright of her life. Staring back at her was a girl, a few years older than her, dressed in a white gown, sitting quietly in the chair outside her door. Now May started to panic. She had no idea who this girl was or why she was sitting outside her door in the middle of the night. She grabbed the hotel phone and dialed her parents' room number, but the phone was dead. Taking a shaky breath, she dared to look through the peephole again, hoping the girl had gone. She was still there, but now she was even closer to the door, so close her bare feet were touching it. Escape was impossible. Then came the noise she dreaded the most. It was gentle, slow, barely even audible. May couldn't bring herself to look again. She jumped into bed, pulled the duvet over herself, and curled into a ball. After what felt like an eternity, sunlight finally swept through the curtains. May hadn't slept a wink. Exhausted, she looked through the peephole one last time. The girl and the chair were gone. She opened the door slowly, checked the empty hallway, then ran down the corridor to her parents' room and refused to come out until they left the hotel. Life is full of unexpected terrors, something those watching Californian magician The Amazing Joe's final performance learned painfully on Halloween night in 1990. Joseph Burris, stage name The Amazing Joe, stared as workers dug away the earth before him, preparing his grave. In front of him was the plastic and glass coffin he was going to willingly climb into. A recovering addict, Joe planned to be handcuffed, chained, locked inside the coffin, buried underground, and then miraculously escape, all to raise funds for a local rehabilitation center, and to cement his place in history alongside his idol, Houdini. But he wasn't worried. He'd practiced countless times before. After performing a few magic tricks to a crowd of 150, including his young children, He climbed into the coffin, gave 2 thumbs up, and was lowered into the earth. The workers shoveled 3 feet of soil on top of him, then a truck pulled another 3 feet of wet cement over that. The crowd held their breath, waiting for the amazing Joe to escape from beneath the suffocating weight of earth and cement. But something went horribly wrong. As the truck pulled away, witnesses saw the entire setup suddenly drop about 2 feet, and then came the sound of shattering. The coffin had collapsed under the immense weight. Workers scrambled desperately to dig Joe out, but it was too late. The amazing Joe truly did follow in Houdini's footsteps, just not in the way he planned. Both lost their lives on Halloween. The broken coffin had trapped Joe beneath a crushing mix of cement and soil, compressing his chest and ending his life. The most horrifying thing, though, the underside of his fingernails were caked with dirt. In his final moments, he'd tried desperately to claw his way to freedom. So what went wrong? Unlike previous attempts where Joe had only used soil, he decided to add concrete, a combination that could have weighed as much as 7 tons. That's heavier than an elephant. Subsequently, he failed to properly calculate whether the coffin could withstand this immense weight and only tested it by jumping on it. Not exactly foolproof. All these mistakes culminated in the grisly end of the amazing Joe. Being trapped in a horror movie is no one's idea of fun, but on Halloween night, Redditor Daily Donuts 16 and his younger brother found themselves living a nightmare. They were stuck at home handing out candy to trick-or-treaters while their parents went out to party. By 10 p.m., nearly all the treats were gone, the decorations had been taken down, and streets had emptied. So Donut and his brother slumped on the couch and watched a scary movie. And then came a knock on the door. Peeved at the late visitor, Donuts went to check through the peephole. Outside stood a trembling rake of a man dressed in a hoodie with hands stuffed in his pockets. He had a dirty beard and his lips were crusty and dry. He knocked again, clearly keen for somebody to open the door. "We're out of candy," Donuts called through the door. The man paused, then smiled, showing off his urine-yellow teeth. "Are you alone in there?" he whispered. "Should I call the police?" Donuts replied. The man's smile vanished, replaced by a flash of fury. Then he slowly walked off their porch. Relieved, Donuts and his brother decided not to call the cops since the stranger left without too much hassle. They turned back to the TV, their parents arrived home safely, and the eerie moment was pushed to the back of their minds. But the following day, the terror came back. News broke that an elderly woman a few houses down had her life brutally taken by an unknown assailant. Donuts and his brother knew exactly who it was. That poor woman hadn't been as wise to the stranger's dark intentions as they had been. The Redditor and their brother gave the cops all the details they could, but the man was never caught. To this day, Donuts wonders if they'd told someone sooner, could that woman's life have been saved? This next particularly chilling tale comes from Diego in London. One day, Diego got a call from his old childhood friend, Gabriel. Poor Gabriel was going through a messy divorce and asked if he could move into Diego's old apartment in Limehouse. Lucky for Gabriel, Diego had a room free and was happy to help his friend. Now, the apartment was an old Victorian build. Other tenants even joked that it was haunted, especially in one particular room. You guessed it. That's the room Gabriel took. Months passed, but things weren't going well. Gabriel, traumatized by his divorce, started dabbling in substances and locked himself away. Despite their history, the two friends barely spoke in the house. Then, in late October, Diego noticed things disappearing from his own locked room. Personal items like photos and sketches, and even a beloved painting he'd made at university. He was sure it was Gabriel, even if he couldn't prove it. So one day he went into Gabriel's room ready to confront him, but couldn't help but stop and listen at the door. There were whisperings coming from inside, rambling about something he couldn't understand. It sounded like two distinct voices, but he was sure no one else was in. His anger was replaced with unease, and he stepped away. On the night before Halloween, Diego double-checked his locked door and went to sleep. However, in the middle of the night, he woke with an uneasy feeling. Sitting up, he saw something in the corner of the room. "What are you doing in my room?" Diego blurted out. The figure's face twisted into pure hatred. It lurched closer to his bed, and Diego saw through the dark that it was Gabriel. His old friend jumped on the bed, hands outstretched like claws reaching for Diego's neck. Luckily, Diego wriggled free and fled into the streets as Gabriel chased him. Some frantic running later, he managed to hide in a supermarket car park while he called the authorities, took Gabriel away. He was ultimately admitted into a mental health facility. Returning home after that terrifying Halloween, Diego found Gabriel's room unlocked. There on the bed were Diego's lost belongings, arranged like some kind of shrine. A cold chill ran down his spine. It was clear that Gabriel struggled with mental illness, but to this day, Diego still doesn't understand how he broke into his locked room, or what those whispered voices really were, and he doubts he ever will. It's not just apartments in London that can harbor monsters. Somewhere in the US, there was a big old 5-story building where Redditor Underpants Bandit and her husband ran their antique business. On Halloween 2022, the pair went out for an early dinner across town. They were having a nice evening when they were called by their security company, saying they detected motion in their shop. Bandit and Jim finished their meal and hurried over, assuming an animal had mistakenly wandered in. Night had fallen, but they were so used to the building that they went through with only the light on their phones to guide them. They went downstairs and reached the motion detector, but there was no animal. What Bandit did find was much more alarming. A burglary kit left on the floor right in front of them, and then it hit them. There were no smashed windows, no broken doors, no anything to imply a break-in, which meant the burglars probably snuck in while they were open and was still inside with them. They both ran out of the shop dialing 911. After the police showed up, Jim and Bandit started going through the security footage, and what they saw made them feel sick. Staring back at them was this face. Gah. When they'd closed, he'd crouched behind a bookcase waiting for them to lock up, and then, when the coast was clear, came out and calmly put on his gloves and mask, looking dead at the camera as he did so. Bandit watched as he slipped through the store, triggering the silent alarm. When he heard Bandit and Jim enter, he abandoned his tools, hid in the shadows, and watched. Then once they'd left, he dashed to the basement, which is where the CCTV feed ended. But from there, he must have crawled through the only exit, a dark, muddy tunnel that led straight into the busy restaurant kitchen. To get out, he'd have to casually walk past the line of chefs out the restaurant, all under camera surveillance. Yet when they checked the tunnel, there were no muddy footprints on the other side. No cooks saw him, and the restaurant footage showed nothing. Wait, what? Where did he go? To this day, no one knows. And now there's the most tragic horror story I have. 16-year-old Yoshihiro Hattori and his friend Webb Haymaker had just been dropped off for a Halloween party. Only they weren't sure it was the right house. Walking through the unfamiliar streets, they spotted one that looked right and knocked on the door. What harm could it possibly do? Turns out, more than they could ever imagine. It was 1992, and Hattori was a Japanese exchange student in Louisiana, staying with Haymaker. He'd immediately made an impression with his free-spirited nature, extroverted personality, and love for life, and the two boys were close. After meeting another Japanese exchange student, he and Haymaker got an invite to a Halloween party in Baton Rouge at number 10131. So they got there and knocked without realizing the house they were knocking on was actually 10311. What was inside was scarier than any monster. After knocking, a woman quickly opened the side garage door and peered at them before slamming it down again. Confused, the pair started walking away, but then they heard the front door open and 30-year-old Rodney Pierce stepped out. He was pointing a .44 Magnum at the teenagers. Hattori turned around and stepped forward. "Freeze!" Pierce spat. Hattori didn't seem scared at all, as if the pistol was just part of a costume. "We are here to party," he said happily, and carried on walking toward the door. Those were his last words. Without another word, Pierce opened fire. The teenager didn't stand a chance. Hattori's parents were told the terrible news by a worker with the exchange program. After learning about their son's fate, his mother went into his room and wept. The news took Japan by storm, where handguns are illegal. Even worse, the police originally released Pierce without charge, arguing it was within his rights to shoot a trespasser. It was only after a torrent of complaints from Louisiana's governor and Japan's New Orleans consul that they charged him with manslaughter. Yet Pierce's lawyer successfully argued that Hattori had scared his meek little wife, and he was just acting in self-defense. Unbelievably, the jury swallowed it, and in 1993, Pierce was acquitted. If you ask me, Hattori's race played a big role, but not only in Pierce's decision to shoot him, but also in the police and court's ambivalence to the young man's death. Rest in peace. That's the end of our tales of terror. Which frightened you the most? And if you have any terrifying tales of your own, be sure to email me. Thanks for watching.